We don't actually use this.
You are live.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our 4th session of the Energy Democracy Training Series. You can check out our previous 3 sessions. Just to do a quick overview, about almost 2 months ago, we did a session. We did a session really looking at the history of the utility industry and how we got to where we are in our energy system, and really how is it structured, why is energy important. Then a couple weeks later, we did a session focused on really the economics and politics and technology around how energy utilities are structured. Really, how do they work, what are the incentives that drive them, and what are the major challenges facing energy utilities right now as we enter this time where the coal industry is dying, natural gas is going through this whole fracking boom, but that's also really struggling in some ways, and renewable energy is really surging forward. 2 weeks ago, we did our 3rd session, which was taking a very different look, really at the structure of our economy, and how do we look at and analyze dollars as a representation of wealth, but also other forms of wealth that are flowing out of our communities through our food systems, our energy systems, housing, all of these types of things. And what are some of the principles for thinking about business and thinking about industry for us to rework those flows of value and build community wealth. And today, in our final session, we are wrapping that all up and tying it together with a session that is focused on community wealth building in the energy sector. And so we're going to be looking at how do we use this moment when utilities are going through this death spiral process to really shift not only the technology of the energy system, but who gets the benefits? Who gets the benefits? Who controls? Who makes decisions? How do we make that whole thing work? So again, if you are joining us today, feel free to jump in, add questions and thoughts. And for all of you who are listening in later, hope you enjoy. We are also very much looking forward to seeing this series develop in the future as we create a toolkit for communities and groups of young people around the country working on energy democracy. And so look forward to that. To get us started, and I'm wondering if we could get a little bit more tilt towards the board or somehow get or a little bit more visible to the folks on the computer. Can you all on the computer see this okay? A little bit of glare.
Oh, that's better.
Yeah, I can see it. This is Paula.
So I want to start by highlighting 2 things. The first in the center here is what I'm going to call the prize. And this in the energy sector is basically what we're fighting over as movements dealing with energy utilities. There is about 1.3 trillion per year nationwide in residential, commercial, industrial sectors being spent on energy. If you look at it household by household, it's about $2,000 per year per family. This is a major source of value. It's currently controlled by very few very large monopolistic companies. We get to move it some. And related to that is this second graph that's over here on the right, which is just a representation of what's going on. This is a summary of where we were at a couple of weeks ago, with fossil fuel and nuclear energy getting more and more expensive over time, and renewable energy getting cheaper and cheaper over time. And as we talked about a month ago, we're right now at about the point where they cross. This is a very important moment because things are about to start changing very quickly, and we need to be ready for it. I'd like to get us started with a story, and this is a story of what happened in a couple of countries in Western Europe about 20 years ago. Germany and Denmark in particular have been visionary leaders in this strategy, and they've actually helped drive some of these changes that have got us to where we are. And I think the way that they've gone about it, the way they've done it, is really powerful in terms of painting a picture of where we can go. So in the 90s, in Germany and Denmark, a lot of concern about climate change, concern about coal, nuclear, all of these types of things, and essentially a very strong political push. We have decided as countries that we need to lead the way towards climate solutions and clean energy. And we want this to be a driver for economic activity and our citizens leading the way in terms of owning, getting the jobs from, and benefiting from this whole transition, because this is a moment to reinvent the economy. And so in both of those countries and a couple of other places, they implemented what in a very technical terms is called a feed-in tariff, which is essentially a right for anyone who wants to generate clean energy to get an established price that will make the numbers work for that energy. So if you sell energy at this price and you are running your business relatively well, you will at least break even or make money. Go ahead. Yes. And the core principle there is that in the front end, at the very beginning, those prices are going to be very high. It's going to be very expensive to sell renewable energy, which means you get a lot of money per unit of energy output, which meant in the short run, an increase in energy prices, right? Because the utilities are now all required to buy renewable energy that is built at a very high rate, and they pay a very high rate for that energy, which does increase energy prices. However, as the industry grows, because so many people are building renewable energy, the cost of building renewable energy goes down. And so year over year, they've decreased the amount that you had to pay for that renewables until now they have some of the cheapest renewable energy in the world. And they have a massive industry. Germany has almost as much, it's a little bit less, it's about 30 or 40% less installed solar than the United States, despite the fact that it is geographically only slightly larger than the state of Minnesota, has much worse sun, and has many fewer optimal places to put it. They have done this amazing explosion in solar in particular, and also wind. Denmark is already at around 30 to 35% powered by wind energy, and they're on a trajectory to reach 60% within the next decade or so. They've made this transition very fast, and yes, there was a short-run high expense of investing in that renewable energy, but now they are generating renewable energy in most cases cheaper than they can generate it from coal, natural gas, nuclear, and these other sources. And in the meantime, they positioned themselves to be global leaders in manufacturing wind turbines, solar panels, all of these types of things, which have been a huge boost to their economy. Most of the wind turbines that we build here in the United States are actually manufactured in Germany, Denmark, Spain, or India. So we're buying our new age technology from overseas because we haven't invested in the policy to do it ourselves. There are increasingly wind manufacturers and solar manufacturers here too. One of the other key things about both of those models, and I'll focus mostly on the Danish model because I think it's slightly better and cooler. They're both really awesome. They made clear that that incentive, that feed-in tariff, if you sell renewable energy, you have the right to get this price. They made sure it was available to every type of entity, not just big corporations or utilities. It was also available to very small collectives of community members who wanted to go out and build their own energy, or wanted to go out and build their own solar. To the point where in Denmark now, over half of the renewable energy that is installed, which is powering more than 35% of the entire country, is owned by cooperatives of Danish citizens. So this is an asset that is generating wealth, that is generating income, that is creating jobs, and that asset is owned and controlled by the people in the communities who are using energy. Same thing in Germany. You have towns that have now kind of specialized their economic activity in cooperative energy development. There are a couple of smaller towns in Germany that generate several 100% of the energy they use and sell the rest to the neighboring towns. And it's cooperative wealth. It's owned by the members of the community. They're generating income from that. These are some of the most successful countries so far in confronting climate change. They are dramatically ramped down their emissions. These are also countries that economically are doing quite well in comparison to quite a bit of Europe and all over the world right now.
Is it somehow related to the fact that they had capital to invest?
They have some capital to invest, yes. But really the thing here is, if you create that price signal that we're going to pay enough for renewable energy, somebody is going to come along and give you capital to invest, because it makes sense. So whether it's your own capital or it's a company or even foreign investment, I mean, that's happening to some other purposes too. That can start the cycle going, and as you start to build wealth, you start to accumulate your own ability to invest capital. And now I want to tie this back to a really key concept that you're kind of drawing out about where are the sources of community wealth building in renewable energy? How do we actually make benefit for community business? Is this all making sense so far? So you're developing renewable energy, and I hope you can see this okay. Yep. Go ahead.
So you're talking about how to switch from the cycle of investing in capital. So we wanted to tell me a little bit more about how you start that cycle going, so that function of our renewable energy strategy, price, cost competitive, those other things, all of those consider. Can you say again how you got the function started?
Sure. Back in the 90s, the German government and the Danish government, and to a lesser degree the Spanish government and all these other countries, essentially established a policy that says anyone in our country who wants to generate wind energy or solar energy, or there's some other technologies that they use this policy for, will have to be paid by the utility this amount. And they set this amount based on what would make the numbers work. Which essentially means anyone who wants to go into this business, who has basically decent business sense and abilities, is going to make money. It's an incentive to get everyone to start building this stuff. And so the solar industry took off, the wind industry took off, and now suddenly you're installing hundreds of megawatts, and pretty soon thousands and tens of thousands of megawatts per year, as opposed to a megawatt here or even a few kilowatts here, just a tiny amount. And because you're now manufacturing and installing that much, your manufacturing industries get to learn how to do it better. They get to economies of scale. They get to lower their production costs. The people who are installing get to get more efficient at it. You don't have crews installing solar panels that are just sitting around the 70% of the time waiting for someone to say, I want solar panels. They have work, as much as they want. So the cost per unit energy drops dramatically. And they ramp down the cost that everyone is allowed to receive based on that trend. And now you have a giant solar industry, which not only benefits Denmark and Germany and these other countries, but it means that when the US or India steps in, the global state of solar manufacturing and solar installation is that much better. So we never had to come in growing our renewable energy industry at the same price point they did, because they went first. But because they went first, they also got a leg up on building the industry. Does that make sense? Okay. So over here, there's in a really simplified way, and I do renewable energy development, and all the parties get pretty convoluted and complex. But to keep it really simple, there's sort of 4 core partners in creating a renewable energy project. You have your developer or owner. This is a company, and in fact, one of the complications is sometimes there are 2 separate entities. That is going about the process of creating the renewable energy, and building and financing and doing all the permitting for your solar panels or your wind turbines, whatever it is, and owning that system and operating it over time. It could be 2 different entities, sometimes it's the same entity. You have your finance source. So this is whoever is putting in the upfront money to build a renewable energy system. Right now I'm working on 2 different community solar gardens, one of which the upfront investment is about $500,000, and the other which the upfront investment is about $1.5 million. Those are small. There are community-owned wind projects in Denmark where the development cost is in the range of $100 million or even higher. So they vary in scale, basically based on how large is the renewable energy system that you're building.
It could be very small scale.
It could be very small scale, yes. It could be the developer here, or the developer is a solar installer, and the owner is you having solar on your roof. And you having solar on your roof, the cost of that system is going to be maybe $15,000. But it's the same basic thing. You have to have an investor, and if it's $15,000, maybe the investor is you, if you have a lot of cash on hand, or maybe it's a bank that will take out a loan.
Can you say who your investors were for those projects, like the 500,000 and the 1.5 million, or?
I'll get to that in a little bit. Because one of the problems that we have here in the U.S. is that this gets really complex because of how we have not set up our standards the way Germany and Denmark did. I'm just trying to lay out a framework for how this works, and then we'll talk about it.
I understand. I just want to know, like, where capital comes from, like where, like for big projects, medium projects, smaller projects. Okay.
Cool. Whoever is developing and owning this has to hire some folks to build it. They might hire people directly, or they might say, we're going to hire this company that already has employees to actually build it. There's also workers involved in operating and maintaining. Wind generally has more operation and maintenance than solar because it has moving parts, and you got to replace gears and all those things that wear out. So there's some amount of operation and maintenance, but in all cases, renewable energy, most of the work is in building it in the first place. And then 25 or 30 years from now, you got to replace it. It just does its thing. And remember, the fuel cost is 0, which is a huge shift. Then you have the energy user, who is actually receiving this energy, and they get the energy and make some payments to the developer. Each of these points is a major site of wealth building, and figuring out how do you balance the wealth building value in each of these sites, and also make sure that each of these parties has as much community benefit as possible is key. Thinking about all 4 of them, I think, is really important. So we'll talk about a really standard model that has very little community wealth. We have I'll make it get real simple. A utility is developing its own renewable energy. Okay? So the utility is here, they're the developer and the owner. In effect, they are selling the same energy, probably not any separately than they are selling energy generally to their existing customers and getting payments. It's probably just part of their fuel mix. Okay? Same bill, same system. They hire people to do the work, and the finance comes from Wall Street banks and investors who have invested in that utility. If this raises the cost of energy for the energy user, this is actually a loss of community wealth for the energy user, right? If it doesn't do anything to the cost of energy, it's just exactly the same cost, then there's really no effect on community wealth to the energy user. There's still some benefit to workers, you know, all of the people who are building that stuff, because if you look at it as a ratio, renewable energy creates more jobs per money invested than fossil fuels, because more of the cost is actually the work to build it as opposed to the fuel and machinery and all of that type of stuff. So there is some benefit here, but it's not all that much. And the financial gains to the financiers and the developer owner are concentrated in the hands, just the way it works in the current system.
So I'd say they're probably really good, like the gains for the big finance people and the developers.
I will get into more specifics about how we do finance in this country right now. It's a very sad story. Courtney is modeling the appropriate face. So to give you a slightly better example, or maybe not better, but a slightly different example. Let's say that we have a private corporation. Let's say the developer owner here is a giant solar company like SunEdison, before they went bankrupt, who is getting finance from Wall Street bankers and other private capital. And they are going to sell energy at a discount to a local government, because a local government in some places can make that choice, depending on the rules, and the rules are very important. They're going to hire workers just the same way. There's going to be some benefit for the workers in construction. Usually, often, they are not as good to their construction workers, even as the utilities are. So there's maybe some losses in that, but it's probably still better than if no one was developing solar in the first place. The local government gets a benefit here because their energy cost goes down because they're offering it at a discount. And you still have a similar type of thing where now instead of the utility making a ton of money and its investors making a ton of money, now a big solar company like SunEdison is making a ton of money, and their investors are making a ton of money. Okay. Maybe there's a little bit more benefit, but largely the same deal. That model that I just described is what is happening with the vast majority of renewable energy development in the United States right now. There is a large private developer that is getting largely Wall Street finance, hiring folks to do the work as cheaply as they can, and selling either to large institutional energy users, universities, hospitals, school districts, local governments, big corporations, or utilities, because utilities also are required to buy renewable energy, and so private developers will sell energy to the utilities. And the developer is out there to make a lot of money. That is how most renewable energy is developed in the US right now. Frowny faces around them. Well, we could do this differently. We could have a model where lots of energy users are allowed to buy the energy, which requires that we have policy in place that erodes the monopoly enough that everyone can actually choose to buy the energy. You have a local business that is, some people in the community who are starting a business who are creating renewable energy and selling it to those users. Because they're a local business, they want to give their workers a decent wage and so on and so forth, and so they get the workers to get some additional benefits from it. And they decide to go out and do a crowd finance campaign for members of the community and get a local bank to give them a loan, and that's how they finance it.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's a model that is, I would say, representative of some of the local solar installers here in Minnesota that are private companies that are out for their own benefit, but are still making some improvements on how that works. some of the key changes that I think are super important is changing this entity to a cooperative or community-owned model, because that means that the profits that accumulate here go to, if it's a cooperative of energy users, it goes back to the energy users. This is what Cooperative Energy Futures is doing. That's who we are. You could also theoretically have a development company that is a worker-owned co-op that is owned by workers. There's some of those around the country. And you could also use that cooperative entity to start sourcing financing from the members to get returns. The finance piece of it comes from some of these folks. Okay? Because as these people have some wealth, they can reinvest it and make a return on that wealth, just like Wall Street does. I mean, Wall Street didn't make money on the investments it makes, it wouldn't do it. So those questions of how do we replace these entities with places that distribute their profits to the people who use their services is a core question about how wealth gets built. And then who sources this money and what returns they get is key to the question of how much community wealth gets built. So
What do you mean, sorry, what do you mean who sources the money?
If we are building our community solar garden by going to JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs and saying, you will give us the money to pay for this wind farm, and they say, sure, we'll give you that money to finance this wind farm. You have to give us a 9% interest rate. Well, if you do the calculations, you can pencil a 9% interest rate. It will work. But 90 or 95% of the value at the end of the day will go to these guys, not these guys. Okay? If instead you have 500 community members who are sourcing capital, and they say, yeah, we're totally fine with a 5% interest rate. The benefit goes to those 500 community members, and there's still 50 or 60% of the value left over to allocate to these folks. That makes sense? And I want to keep in mind, like right now I'm just talking about relatively small amounts of money, but that's like project by project. We're talking about how do we rework this flow of value with this amount of money. Okay? That's the question of the next, like, 2 to 3 decades.
95% is very different.
Yes, yes. 9 and 5% are the differences of tens and tens of billions of dollars per year. There's a lot of money going around. Just to give you a sense, finance and investment in renewable energy is in the hundreds of billions per year in the United States already. And it's growing rapidly. I was just reading today, and I was going to send this out after this training just as a follow-up, this really great report. I'm getting all these like really great reports on the energy transition from like business research folks. This is from Bloomberg. They're essentially saying we are right now at the peak point in the coal, oil, and gas industry. Not simply because the price is going up, which it is, especially for coal and increasingly oil, but because renewable energy is getting cheaper so much faster that even if natural gas stays super cheap, it's not going to be cost competitive. That's what's happening. Like we talked about in session 2 about the utility debt spiral, it's going to take a while, and there's going to be lots of fights, you know, community by community, state by state, over this coal plant and that nuclear plant, and all of that type of thing. And that's going to take like the next decade or 2. But it's going to happen. There really isn't anything about the fundamentals of what is happening here that gives any option in the long run for dirty energy industries to dominate the market. There isn't. Utilities are fighting tooth and nail to block all of the options from doing this thing to slow down that process. And that's a big piece of the question. But at a certain point, the economics just get so stark that building new renewable energy is cheaper than operating existing fossil fuels. And that's coming not 100 years from now, but like 10 or 15 years from now.
I'm curious what happens to some key projections from the graph if, say, the costs for melting solar went down fast.
Solar is already on an exponential growth curve. The cost going down faster than expected would only steepen the growth curve. But to give you a sense, in the last couple of years, total global investment in solar alone exceeds total global investment in coal, oil, and gas.
Sorry, as of when?
Like the last couple of years. I think 2013 is the first year where there was sort of that big shift. Same thing with wind. Okay, we're witnessing this massive turning point. Now remember, that's investment, so that's building new stuff, and we have to build new stuff incredibly quickly because in the U.S. renewable energy, if you're not counting big hydro, is still only about 5% of our energy usage. You can double 5% for quite a long time before it's a done thing. Not forever, but.
It's not totally economic perspective on how it works. With being such a fight against it, there's a groundswell against the people that are up there getting their wells polluted and with fracking. More and more people are aware of it, what's happening in their neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So the shift of sort of attitudes, I would think, would add quite a bit to it, since we see actually we're talking about life and death and their children's life and death and their land being ruined and all those attitudes, I would think would be pushing from another way now.
Yes, and what has actually been happening now for at least a decade, and I'd say in some ways probably 15 to 20 years in this country, is that the utility industry has very much played that ethical and moral concern off of a story about economics that is less and less true. And honestly, the climate and renewable energy sector has walked straight into that trap. The kind of classic example of this that I always use is Proposition 87 in California. This was a move towards more clean energy, more choice for consumers, that was going to radically ramp up renewable energy generation. It was actually projected to lower energy costs for energy users. The way the environmentalists were talking about this was, this is a climate solution, this is about protecting the environment, saving the climate, all of that. The utilities specifically targeted low-income communities and communities of color, saying you should vote against this referendum because it's going to raise your energy costs.
So blatant lie.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, and like marginal raising, right? So they're blowing the cost effect out of the lot.
yes, and also you're talking about, like, yes, in the short term, some of these initial investments in renewable energy raise costs. They don't raise costs as much as costs are already being raised by the cost overruns and fuel expenses and all of that, of nuclear plants, coal plants, all of that type of thing. And in the long run, they lower costs.
There was quite a ways back when silver mining companies were discussing taconite into the water. Newspapers and it's owned by iron companies there. It's putting out posters saying environmental where the crazy environmentalists are going to take away the jobs of your children.
Mm-hmm.
Well, your children are going to die because of taconite in their water. But we're so afraid of losing the jobs, and their kids not having jobs because that's the only jobs they can see was working. Mm-hmm. The same thing with the coal industry. Yep. What are they going to do? They won't have jobs. They can scare them with the immediate.
And I think that that's really why community wealth building and getting good at it and being able to do it at scale is key, because as long as we are creating an opposing situation between people's immediate material needs and what we need to do long term for the planet and justice and all of those types of things, it's very hard for people to reconcile that. But that's not actually the choice we have anymore. The choice we have right now is, do we create solutions that are better and better for meeting our material needs and solve long-term problems like climate change and economic inequality and that? Or do we just keep propping up income inequality and extraction of the planet that we live on? That is the choice right now. And the more that we can help people see and feel that, and actually prove it, not just say it, but actually prove it. This is how this works. This is how this is going to cut your energy costs, improve your air, your air and breathing quality and all that type of thing, make your home more comfortable, create jobs for unemployed people in the community, and fight climate change and resolve this energy crisis and give you more control of the physical things that you need to run your life. That's what this is about. I hope that's an exciting platform to go into the rest of this training off of. Cool. Just wanted to check if anyone on the computer wanted to ask anything or add anything, or just checking on that.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
If you could put questions asked, so we can see a little more clearly, that would be helpful.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yep. Paul was asking for me to repeat the questions that were asked so that people can hear them.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that earlier you said that when you were talking about like this old story that's been told about our economy and choosing like this false choice of jobs over saving the planet, and you said that like that environmental nonprofits or groups have walked right into this trap, and I didn't hear you explain like what was the trap that they walked into.
Oh, the trap is if the frame the utilities and big industry in general is using is jobs and quality of life in general versus future environmental protection, then if the way you talk about this is solely about future environmental protection, and the people who are talking about it are mostly white, middle class, go down the list, radical and right, oh, so yeah, great, then the story you're presenting makes sense in utility and big industry's frame. And those happen time and time again. And the super exciting fights that I'm seeing right now are where people are pointing out, hey, actually what's going on is the status quo is ripping us off. Our money is getting drained away by these coal plants that are being proposed and built and are never affordable, and these nuclear plants that are going 2 and 3 and 5 times over their cost estimates. And why are we building this stuff at all when the cost of fueling it is going up exponentially? And especially to the extent that we can help people connect that back to the things we talked about in second training about, well, why is it in the utilities incentive to do this? Oh, right, because they make a profit on all the stuff they get approved to build, not on delivering the most cost-effective service. So if we can help people rework the way they think about the incentives here and stand up and be ready to fight for what's actually in our interest, that changes the game. But it's very hard to get that to happen on a mass basis if people haven't seen it. And it's a problem that we develop renewable energy the way it has mostly been developed so far, because it is giant corporations building it mostly in places where nobody sees, and the people who do see it as this is a big corporation that is taking over land and wealth. There's mass opposition in so many rural communities around the country to Florida Power and Light and There's a whole bunch of big companies that are building large-scale renewable energy. And it's not seen as a positive thing. It's seen as, this is just another example of the erosion of family farming and local control and an economy that we can all survive in. So I'm going to point out a couple of key choices that are essential in this. The first choice, and we talked about this in the nature of monopoly, is who gets to be an energy user who can decide to buy energy from some other source. Currently in most states, and we looked at these before in the second training, only the utility can decide to buy energy from anyone except the monopoly utility. Mm-hmm. So in states like here in Minnesota that have monopolies, the only entity that can decide to buy energy from a third party is the utility itself. So the utility can say, so let's say Xcel Energy here in Minnesota, I want to buy solar from company A or company B or this other project that wants to sell us energy. The utility is the only one who gets to decide, I want to buy that energy. You as an individual energy user, or even a big business or a city government, can't say, I want to buy energy from this third company. The only person they can buy energy from is the electric utility. Okay? So if the only entity, if you're a third-party clean energy developer, if the only entity that you can sell to is an energy utility, who has the cards in the negotiation about what the price is? Right, the utility. Sort of one question.
Yeah.
Then there start to be questions about, well, a utility is regulated, theoretically. So are there rules about what the utility has to pay you? Because if there are rules about what the utility has to pay you, you start to get closer to that scenario we were talking about in Germany and Denmark, where it's easy for everyone to access. So there's a couple of ways you can open up access to this. One is through direct consumer choice. So in about 11 or 12 states, mostly on the East Coast, but also like Ohio, Illinois, Texas, and because they're heavily densely populated states, those states are about 40% of the U.S. population. In those states, you as an individual consumer can choose where do you want your energy source to come from. So you still have the same local utility that manages your wires and your building, but the actual energy that you pay for, you can say, oh, I want it to come from this utility, whatever, or I want to buy it from a third-party provider who could be running a wind farm or a solar plant, or it doesn't have to be clean, it could be natural gas plants or whatever they want to be generating energy. So there's direct consumer choice. Since we have some folks on the line from Michigan, Michigan is an interesting case because they have a 10% carve-out of consumer choice, meaning up to 10% of the customers get to choose, and everyone else can't.
How does that get to
Whoever's first, which effectively has meant large industrial and commercial customers have chosen to ditch the main utility, and everyone else is stuck. And they're maxed out after more space. So how those rules get set up is state by state, and it really matters. There's also some states that do this thing called community choice aggregation, which is effectively the same thing, except it's not individual by individual. Community choice aggregation means your local government gets to choose. So in Illinois, for example, the city of Chicago can, on the behalf of all of its residents and businesses, say, we want the power supply of the city of Chicago to come from this provider or that provider or whatever, because in Illinois, they have community choice aggregation.
So that would be decided on by a city council? Or
city council, or it can also be county, so county commissioner boards, various things like that. You can aggregate it a number of different ways. In some cases, even quasi-governmental agencies like public school districts, park boards, public universities can do that in states that have this type of thing. They can just choose. We
I was
want.
gonna say, yeah, you can choose the aggregation, or is that a choice made by the community, or is that a broader?
So
outcome?
the state law essentially says, here are the rules by which entities get to do this, and then based on those rules, those entities can decide to do it. And it's a little different in each state. I think community choice aggregation is now active in 6 states. The most active programs are, I think, Ohio and Illinois, but there's quite a few in California. There's a big fight going on there. Now, again, remember, both of these things are direct threat to the utilities' monopoly and therefore their ability to make profit, because if you take away some of their customer base and some of their usage, then they have to pay for all of their infrastructure using that same cycle we talked about 2 trainings ago. And they have to raise their prices to make the same amount of money, which just encourages one of their customers to do the same thing. And that's the utility that's part.
Well, what if a developer or an energy utility like isn't like they don't serve like the area in which you're in? Can you still, like, in these like circumstances, can you choose to get energy from them?
Yes, in this case, the developer is not usually a utility. Or in fact, in these cases, they have separated power providers from distribution utilities. So you still get the energy distributed through your local utility, and you still get a portion of your bill that is still paid to that same utility, which is essentially for the service of operating the wires and maintaining the transformers and doing the billing. But a substantial portion of your bill, it depends on the context, but it's usually around 60 to 65% of your bill, is not paid to your local utility. It's paid to whatever company you decided to get your power from, because it's for the actual energy you're using, not for the infrastructure to deliver it. Make sense? In Minnesota, for all of us in the state, the state regulators are very concerned about anything that sounds like deregulation, because they think it's a less cost-effective way of doing it. Deregulation in energy, if it's done right, which is kind of what these things start to do, is, in my opinion, a good thing, although it has to be done right, and if you don't do it right, you get whatever, which is a mess. But we won't go there right now. There's a couple of other ways you could do this. You could essentially say, we are going to have a utility managed program in which any energy user can opt into to get energy from a third party. So an example of this is a community shared renewables, such as a community solar program. All right. This is changing everything. So essentially what this says is you still have to get your power through your current utility, but your utility is required to allow third-party developers to build clean energy and connect it to the grid, and any customer who wants can opt in to get their energy from that source. Okay? So I think it's really, on the face of it, very, very similar to this, except there's very specific rules about how a developer can offer energy and how much the customer gets for it. Because essentially what happens in these cases is the utility gives a credit on the utility bill for the amount of energy that is produced by the energy user, because they're kind of treating the developer owner as a pass-through. So in this case, you have a situation in which you have utility, and what's actually going on here, what's actually going on here is the energy is not being delivered to the energy user, it's being delivered the developer is delivering energy to the utility, and the utility is delivering energy to the energy user. And the utility, because they're getting energy, is also making payments. And there's also payments on that one. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I don't understand why the utility is making payments. Yeah.
So effectively what this says is you as an energy user get to choose to opt into a project built by a developer, which means there's some relationship where you're paying the developer for that right. And the developer is delivering energy to the utility, and the developer does not get paid for that by the utility. The utility instead pays the energy user for their share of that energy. So if it's helpful, think of this relationship as the old relationship, right, where the utility delivers the energy and the energy user delivers or gives payments. And now there's a new relationship, which is this relationship. Does that make sense? So the utility is still delivering regular old energy to the energy user, and the energy user pays for their utility bill. That's the things inside this blue bubble. That's the current relationship. That's how energy works with the utility currently. Now we're adding a new thing where an energy user says, I want in to this community solar project, or theoretically it could be a community wind project, whatever it is, and I'm going to pay for that being in a very structured payment. That gives the developer the financial means to say, I'm going to get finance and pay some workers to build this thing, and then we're going to deliver energy to the utility. Now, the utility is getting this energy, which is valuable, and there's state laws that say the utility has to provide just compensation for that energy. And that just compensation is paid to the energy user.
Seems like this is a clever way to like get around facing the interactive problem by adding in step. So instead of a energy user simply paying a utility for the energy, they do that. Additionally, they have the option to buy into a solar or wind cooperative, something like that, where if you had the direct consumer choice option, you would probably be paying a little bit more because you're opting for wind or something like that, right?
It depends. In many cases, it's actually cheaper.
Okay, so but you're making decisions about like paying more or less money based on that. So in this scenario, in the community shared renewables, the extra money that you'd be paying possibly would go towards the developer, who then you're getting payments from your utility in the form of credits. But this is a negative. You pay your utility less because of how much they owe you for you owning the source of energy that they're getting. You could buy into funding the grid with energy, and they have to fund you back from that.
Another way of saying this is that in a community shared renewable system, they treat this energy that is being delivered as being divided up proportionally among all the energy users who are subscribing to this thing. And so all these energy users are supplying energy to the utility, and the utility pays them for it, and the way they pay them for it is an offset on the bill.
Does that, I don't know how to ask this question in this, but does that influence that early system of pools, right? Why the disincentive to add renewable energy to the market?
So one of the key questions in the design of these programs is, what is the price that the utility is required to pay to the end user? Because that sets the price that the energy user can afford to pay the developer, which allows them to go to their finance people and say, there's this cash flow. If this number is too low, the only way a developer can make it work is by charging the energy user more than they're saving.
you don't want to do that.
And then they probably won't want to do it, and only a tiny proportion of people who are like, yeah, I'll throw money at this because I care, will do it. The other core thing is effectively, is the rules about this relationship such that it says anyone can deliver this energy, and the utility must accept it. In most states around the country where they've built community shared renewables programs, there is a cap, which essentially says the utility is only required to accept this many megawatts per year of community solar that is built, which dramatically limits the ability to participate in the volume. In Minnesota, thankfully, we have a pretty good rate. It's enough to make a cash flow with actually payments from the energy user that are less than their savings. So people save money. And there's no cap, which means any developer that is able to do all of the work to do this gets to develop solar. Now, there are some barriers. The rules here say that the developer has to jump through a whole lot of hoops to work with the utility. And the utility also has control of the grid. So the utility gets to say how much it costs to connect to the grid within some certain rules. So there is friction and problems here because they haven't simplified it enough. But if you want to think about it this way, this innovation, and I'm super excited about this because this is changing the game in Minnesota, and it's like the core I spend time on of it, this is effectively what they did in Germany and Denmark. Just about anyone with some friction and annoyances can develop renewable energy. The utility must buy it, and they must buy it at a rate that is enough, just happens to be enough, to make a cash flow. That was passed in Minnesota in 2013. It took until late 2014 for the rules to all be worked out. Excel created enough friction so that it took a very long time before the first projects were being built. But to give you a sense of the scale and impact of this model, in the whole history of Minnesota to date, we've only built about 30 megawatts of solar. And the expectation is this year alone, we will build about 400 megawatts of solar. And this is just the beginning. And I want to emphasize here again that the reason that happened was a game-changing model that essentially did those two things of more or less securing the right of anyone to put a certain kind of energy at a certain size, so it's limited, but to put that energy on the grid, and the utility must pay for it at an adequate rate to make it work.
So is that model not the same state by state?
It is not the same state by state. In fact, only I think it's changing rapidly because this is a very popular model now. There's about 13 states around the country that have community solar, and most of them have caps, so it's not really everyone can build. And many of them have payments that are low enough that it's a premium product. So we're not yet at national getting all the barriers out of it, but we're getting close.
Sorry, I can stop that position. I mean, is this an intermediate goal or a long-term goal to have these?
We will. The question was, is community solar the long-term goal, or is it the interim? And then there was a question
Or just that model.
This model.
Yeah.
And then the question was, do we want to eliminate utilities? I don't have a good answer to that question yet. Utilities do some very valuable things, and for better or worse, mostly worse, they are just about the only ones who know how to do it yet. So I am not entirely clear how much the skill set of a utility in managing the grid in the old model where they pumped lots of energy from big power plants to destinations is still going to be applicable when energy is being produced everywhere and used where it's produced. I don't know how relevant that expertise is going to be. I know I don't yet have the experience to run that system. And if it's not the utility, we're going to have to do a lot of work to figure out some like solid expertise among tens or hundreds of thousands of people to manage that system, because it's complex technology with energy moving virtually at the speed of light in a fast network. So it's a big question. I don't know. I suspect realistically what's going to happen is utility will play some role and they're going to be involved somehow, and a lot of innovation is going to happen that will make more and more of what they do not obsolete and not relevant. Just to give a quick point on that, New York is doing this very interesting thing where they have now regulated, this was just passed like in the past couple of months, and so it hasn't fully been implemented. In fact, it'll probably take years to fully implement. But they are redefining the utility not as the deliverer of energy, but as a platform for energy service. Who's trying to come in? I'm not sure that they are. Cool. We're going to keep going if we can have focus and concentration. So in New York, what they are doing is essentially saying the utility is now a platform for energy service. Instead of generating and producing energy, their job is to manage the grid for all of the people who are producing and using energy, and set the rules and the marketplace so people can interact with one another. So they are no longer making their money selling energy. They are making their money sort of just managing the grid for everyone who's doing that stuff. So this is a thing that New York is changing the rules about in terms of what utilities will do in the future.
So with that,
so I believe New York State is trying to find a business model for a bunch of organizations. Right?
Yes. Because utilities are regulated companies, and therefore they have to play by their state's rules. Lee? Oh, and the question there was basically New York just redefined the business model for both companies. Yes.
so is what how does what New York was just redefined have to do with the maybe softening the utility death spiral or in some way?
That is one of the big questions. I am not clear because I've not, Lee asked, how is what New York just did related to softening the utility debt spiral? That's one of the big questions, and I don't actually know the details of what's going on in New York because like the level of detail I can get into is like reading the 3-page article about it. If you really want to understand the implications, you're talking about like hundreds of pages, but dense technical information. One of the key questions there is the return or profit to the utility under this new model where they're serving as the platform, is it intended to just be enough for them to maintain and operate and make money off of that platform? Or is it also intended to make them enough profit to cover all the profit they're losing from the coal and nuclear and gas plants that they no longer can profitably operate? And this is what I talked about about a month ago in our second training, where in some of these states that have deregulated and gone to consumer choice, the utilities are now saying, we can't afford to operate this nuclear plant. We can't afford to operate this coal plant. Hey, state regulators, you need to force all the ratepayers to pay us for that stuff, even if they don't use it. So these are the fights, right? And I've just highlighted some of the core fights around how do we open access to who gets to choose where they get their energy. That's only one of the sites here, right? It's only one of the places where we have to intervene, but I really wanted to focus on that core set of questions. And there's some other mechanisms, and I don't want to go way into these, but who gets to be the energy buyer? You can also do leasing, you can do third-party power purchase agreements. There's other ways of allowance, but basically that's a separate intervention. We can move on. Now let's talk about finance. I think in some ways this piece over here, the who provides the capital and how much do they get for it is, I was going to say the $1 million question, but no, probably the $1 trillion question. Yeah, more than that actually. of the future of the renewable energy industry. And this is getting at what Patty asked earlier about who finances these things. Okay, so in Germany and Denmark, this highly successful model that I highlighted in the beginning, the way they created the incentive was essentially through this relationship. Okay, anyone who generates energy has a right to get paid this amount, and that created an incentive that lots of financiers wanted to participate in, and a lot of the bargaining chip there in the relationship was with the developer. Okay, because the developer knows that they can get this price of energy from anyone, and any investor will do. So the investors all have to commit. That's not how it works in the United States. What we have done in the United States to incentivize renewable energy is essentially said, whoever owns and finances renewable energy can get very large credits on their taxes. For solar, that is a tax credit worth 30% of the value of the system. So if I build $1 million solar farm, in year one, I get to take $300,000 off my taxes. I don't have $300,000 in taxes. So in order for that to work, I gotta find someone who pays $300,000 worth of taxes. It gets worse. In our infinite wisdom, we have also decided in this country to finance lots of things by essentially writing their value off on our taxes over time. So this is called depreciation, and it essentially means if you buy a building for 20 years, in here, the way we pay taxes for a business, if you're a business, you don't pay taxes on your income. You pay taxes on your profits. So you pay taxes on your income minus your expenses. But if you bought a building, you're going to have a ton of expenses in 1 year, probably more expenses than your entire income. And so instead what they do is essentially say that building is worth a certain amount, and it's going to lose its value year to year. For a building, the schedule is usually 20 years. In year one, you get to write 1/20th of the value of the building on your taxes. Makes sense? So like, you get to add 1/20th of the value of the building to your expense item. You do the same in year 2, and year 3, and year 4, all up to year 20. So you spread the value of that investment out over time, and that reduces your tax rate. Well, to incentivize renewable energy, the federal government has essentially said, we will allow you to write off the value of the system, the depreciation, faster than you otherwise would. In fact, they even accelerated it even more last year by creating a 50% bonus for solar, which essentially means even though this is an asset that is guaranteed, there are warranties and insurance and all of that to last and be productive for 25 years. In year one, you get to take about 60% of the value of that system off of your taxes. And then there's another little bit for the next 5 years. The effect of this is basically to say, if you have that tax liability and you have a corporate tax structure where you can write that value off your taxes, you get so much of your money back in year one, and quite a bit in year 2 and year 3. And like in principle, that's great. It's a great way to incentivize things, except that it only works for people who pay a ton of taxes and who have a corporate structure that is taxed at a 35% tax rate. Okay? So what has this created is a whole industry, which I end up working with quite a lot. I don't like it much. In what's called a tax equity. And what tax equity is essentially, we're making an equity investment in renewable energy. We are going to put in money into this solar farm or this wind farm or whatever it is. And the primary benefit that we will get out of it is these tax credits. We don't actually get cash out of it. We get avoided taxes out of it. The tax equity investor, which effectively ends up being companies with lots of income, because they have lots of tax liability. This is the standard way that we finance renewable energy in this country. And it is very, very hard to finance it any other way because the value for solar, and wind is a little different, but it ends up being kind of the same thing. The value of that tax equity is somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of the entire cost of the project. So if you say, I want to finance a solar project or a wind project, and I'm not going to use tax equity, you're leaving 40 to 50% of the cost having to be covered through some other way, which means the rate of return you can give to the people who are giving you that money goes way down, like to a point where basically nobody will give you that.
If you are or
aren't using tax equity. You are not using tax equity. You're essentially saying instead of having to find financing for 50 to 60% of the project that isn't covered by tax equity, we have to make the same cash flow cover 100% of the project. Okay? It's virtually cost prohibitive. I am really, really hopeful that in about 5 years, when a lot of these tax credits start winding down, we will be far enough along this declining cost curve that we can actually finance all of these things with no tax equity at all. And that's just going to be good.
By winding down, you mean like the
the question was, what do I mean by winding down? The federal government essentially has said that 30% tax credit for solar is in effect for any project that is built between now and the end of 2019. And then starting in 2020, it's a little bit less than 30%. And by end of 2022, it's only 10%. So it kind of ramps down just by federal law.
or you've got your group who can build who can develop solar power or wind power, whatever. They've built that to go and they'll get 30% off. If someone else starts another one, the next year they get that, they get the same thing. Or this one, as they go along, the next year they're going to get less coming in, and this year they're going to get less coming in.
No, it's unlimited for the years that it's in effect. So between now and 2019, everyone who builds renewable energy gets to take 30% off through a tax. Build solar gets to take 30% off in the first year. And then there's that accelerated depreciation.
So the first one's going to start now, in 3 years, it'll be down to like 10% or something. And someone who starts 3 years from now will start at 30, and 3 years from now,
No. Let's talk a little bit about the details of how those numbers work offline outside of this.
Yeah.
The real principle, just to note here, is that so much of the value in financing these things is in tax credits, and only a very small number of entities can use those tax credits, and it's pretty complex. Can I just go almost for a while? Because it's pretty complex, even most small business entities that have the tax liability don't want to go through the legal and accounting work on this complex industry that they've never understood before to do this. Which means that really the only people who do tax equity is a relatively small number of very large private equity firms who specialize in doing it, because they have the lawyers and the accountants and they have tons of capital and they can aggregate lots of investors to put that in. Very few of them want to do small projects, and by small I mean very few of them want to invest less than $10 million, because it's too much work for them to figure out if it's a good deal if the deal is too small. They are also not interested in anything that feels complicated. Having lots of energy users in a community solar garden is itself complicated for them. They want to have one big entity that has a wonderful credit rating, like a local government or a big corporation. More and more of them are starting to say, oh, community solar opens up so much more business, we need to get flexible and allow lots of energy users. But we don't want to talk about low credit people, or low income people, or we don't want to work with a developer that wants ownership, because it's more complicated. and that's going to be costly. Okay? So the normal state of financing renewable energy right now is very large, effectively Wall Street private equity, putting in the tax equity. By federal law, the tax equity investor has to own the system for the first at least 6 years. And usually they don't want to give it up. That's what allows them to qualify for getting those tax credits. Okay? So it kind of makes sense that the vast majority of renewable energy that has been built so far is giant scale and financed by big private investors. Now, this has been very effective at building lots of renewable energy quickly. It has not been effective at building it in a distributed model that will make fossil fuel obsolete. Right? Remember when we went back to how the utility system is structured and we talked about really we have to be siting renewables where they're used. They need to be spread out all over the place. We need diversification, we need all of that. That's not what these folks want to do. They want to build 100 acres of solar in one location and pump it off their transmission. Or a whole bunch of wind all in one space and put it on transmission. Because it's simple and they don't have to deal with things like lots of community members. We're complicated. And there are a lot of things other communities. So this is the normal state of the industry. Figuring out how we change this relationship is key. And that's honestly one of the bigger challenges that I spend my time on, one of the bigger challenges that I think we need to be spending our time on if we want to address community wealth building in this and drive the utility debt spiral in a way that's going to create community wealth. Part of this becomes how could we create our own fund? And I'm in a number of discussions right now about basically creating our own tax equity fund that is still pretty large, but smaller scale investors who, oh, and I forgot to say this, the rates of return that most of these folks currently want are in the range of 25 to 30%. Okay? For those of you on the computer and in the future, there are shock faces around them. Yeah, exactly. If you're looking for 25 to 30%, how much is going to be left for these guys? Right? Not very much. We've been offering or exploring how do we start finding tax equity investors who are willing to take 15%. Still a really good return. But at 15%, with all of the gravy that the federal government puts in the tax credits, there's a lot of wealth left down here. That makes a huge difference. Again, because that's 15% is very little cash. It's the tax credits. The cash is still mostly controlled by these folks. And then ultimately, as the tax credits wind down and renewable energy gets cheaper and cheaper, how do we get rid of the tax equity folks? Tax equity, as I mentioned, ends up being 40 to 50% of the solar project. I don't actually know the numbers for wind because the wind tax credits are not a 30% upfront. They're essentially a cent per kilowatt hour tax credit incentive. So it's structured differently. Basically, for the first 10 years, you get to write a certain amount off the taxes based on how much energy your wind system produces. And I can give you the numbers on how much it is, but I don't know what the value of the tax equity is for a wind project, just because I'm not in the wind business. But it's a basically similar model. The other 50 to 60% is usually debt. Okay, so we're going to take out a loan for 50 to 60% of the project, and that's going to pay the developer to pay the workers and build the system, and then the developer is going to pay off that loan by collecting payments from the energy user and using it to pay off the loan. And usually this is probably a lot of developers would keep these numbers very close to their chest. Usually 5 to 7% interest on the debt. More and more it's getting towards the low end because people are saying, no, this is, we know how this works. This is very familiar. And it's usually about 15-year debt. So you're going to be paying 5 to 7% interest, 15 years. Okay. Usually, historically, this has been big banks. So lots of banks, once you have your tax equity, will be perfectly happy to finance these types of things, especially if they're large, simple, all the things I already said. It's harder to get banks to finance smaller things, but also if you have smaller things, this chunk of it, the debt chunk of it, there's not really no reason it has to be a bank. You could decide we want our local governments to offer municipal bonds, and the bondholders who are members of the community are going to make money off of that debt. We could say we're going to run a crowdfunding campaign, and any member of our community can invest, anything above $500, and they're going to get a 5 or 6% rate of return on that money they invested. If you're a co-op, you could go out to your members and say, hey members, we want to build some solar for some more members. Who wants to loan us money at 5%? You're allowed to do that. Now, I'm not going to go into securities law and all of the financial sector restrictions right now. And I do some of those trainings too. But that's not what this is about. So there are rules around who can source that money and how expensive and difficult it is to do, who can you advertise to. There's a lot of rules there, and it's complicated. But learning those complications and learning what to do about them is sort of at the root of how do we replace this from being the big banks to being cities, credit unions, and community members who are the source of financing. And that's starting to change out who provides the capital to big people. And again, right now with the numbers, I don't see any way that you can actually get rid of tax equity. So it's like we're playing around with 50 to 60% is debt, and the rest we're still getting from big money. But 5 years from now, that may no longer be the case. This is a core problem, and honestly, the moment that we find a scalable solution to tax equity and renewable energy for cooperatives, community-owned enterprise, all of these types of things, explosions can happen. I'm so excited for that moment.
Explosions like
a good explosion, an explosion of wonderful community on renewable energy. Cool. Is this all good? Cool. How do we make sure that workers are getting a good deal? There's a lot of different pieces of this. Part of it is union labor. Part of this is having contractors that are local and have direct accountability not to investors but to their communities, and organizing organizations that are helping workers take power and make sure that they're getting a fair deal. Worker co-ops. You could have developers that are worker-owned. You could start a worker-owned solar business. That's totally doable. And also, who gets to be a worker in the solar industry? And a lot of our work on our community solar gardens here in Minnesota is about how do we make sure that in every contract, because what we do as cooperative energy futures is we develop solar gardens, we hire an installation company, and that installation company hires their own workers and does their own thing. And we do that because they have the expertise and the technology, they're good and efficient at it, they know how to do it. But we write into that contract, we're going to pay you so much to build this solar system, that you have to have 50% of your workforce or more be minority labor. And you have to source that through a job training program that is working in North Minneapolis to train folks in solar panels. And there's other ways of doing it. That's just how we do it. But there's all sorts of ways to make sure that there's more value being captured here and that that value is being equitably distributed. In general, solar jobs are pretty good paying. they're high quality, lots of opportunity for upwardability. Because you're like starting off, just doing sort of basic construction stuff, but there's opportunities to get into electrical work and solar design and all of those other types of industries. But right now, the vast majority of people who install solar are white men. And, that's great, but what about everywhere else? So that's about all I was going to say on this worker chunk, but making sure that it's really open and everything.
Yeah, I just, that seems like a lot of flexibility that you have to be able to like negotiate contracts. And I'm just wondering, like with installers and with other folks who are doing maintenance, and I'm wondering, like, is that just a reality that you can have a lot of say?
Could folks on the computer hear that question, or do I need to repeat it?
I will. You don't have to repeat. Patty's is pretty clear. Thanks.
Great. The basic principle here is supply and demand. If we as the installer are demanding a lot of business, they want to supply. Right now, economically, there's not a lot of market pressure to force lots of installers to perform at those high quality standards for two reasons. One, very few of the developers are demanding that they do so. And these installers have so much business, more than they can possibly handle, that they can be choosy. The reason we've been able to exert pressure on that is because there are some developers here in the Twin Cities that are locally rooted, that have values and have ethics, that are willing to say, no, we're going to take the high road. We believe that it is in our interest as a company to diversify our workforce and show that we're committed to all these things, because we believe that it will get us more business. And also because they just so over time, if we as a cooperative and other companies like us more and more develop more and more solar, both on an absolute basis and as a percentage of the solar industry, and other companies do the same, then we create market power as a source of demand, where a lot of the demand for solar says, we want justice in the workplace, and therefore the suppliers of that service have to do that. So that's how it all works. The one place we haven't touched here is who is the developer and owner. This gets real complicated because I work with a lot of people who are individual, sole proprietors, family-owned businesses in this industry, and who have gone through some real rough times. Ralph Jacobson is a local solar installer I work with all the time. He calls this industry the solar coaster because he has had many, many years where he has not made any money or lost money many years in a row. Now, he's nearly gone out of business several times because of how hard it has been. He started his company in the early 90s and has been installing solar since then, and that's rough. Now they're in a cycle where they could be poised to make millions of dollars because the solar industry is exploding. On the one hand, he's taken a lot of risk. He's worked his ass off for 25 years. I think there's some reasonableness to get some real reward out of that. At the same time, if that's all this is, once solar becomes a profitable established business, whoever's in the business is going to make a ton of money. And so how do we start to share the benefit on this end too? And that's in large part why I believe in a cooperative approach. I think it doesn't have to be all of it. I think local business, women-owned business, it's all great. But I think cooperative business has a huge role to play here in making sure that the benefits, the profits from operating this business model is shared by the people who use it. one of the things I'm most excited about and kind of turning this business model piece back into an organizing strategy. I also think that strategy is incredibly powerful in terms of our competition and comparative advantage. Because if we are a member-owned and controlled business, we have a direct model that is about organizing thousands and thousands of people who are energy users to participate in the business of doing this. Which means if we get good enough at it and we consistently deliver the best value to our users, we start to effectively become an energy users union. You can't, at a certain point, you can start to say we control enough of the demand for energy that we get to say how it's supplied. We can compete with developers who are not developing solar, not developing wind the way we want, because there aren't enough energy users to buy their product because they want to be with us. And to the extent that we can actually build and deliver that model, we're creating power and capacity to fuel this cycle in a way that is actually building community wealth. And it's actually helpful to not be in it for the profit, because it means that you can afford to deliver better value for your energy users. So we can afford to deliver better value for energy users, which makes it more attractive for energy users to work with us, which gives us more agency in setting the terms of how this industry works. And we're already we have all sorts of challenges just doing this. Because we're small, our relationship with the utility is just difficult because of the scale. I've told you all the things that financiers don't want to do. We are doing virtually all of the things that financiers don't want to do.
You see that.
Yes, yeah, talking about quality features here. And it's really, really hard. But the moment we're basically right there now, the moment that this starts clicking, it's demonstrating a model, and they want to scale. It's cool. So, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Basically, just once that model gets proven and the benefits start flowing towards those energy users, we will actually be able to harness and use and build off of the thousands of people across the Twin Cities who are really excited about what we're doing. Many of whom are already on our list, dozens of whom are already in action teams in neighborhoods across the Twin Cities ready to launch these projects for what they can do. So we're kind of sowing the seed and laying the groundwork for really blowing up this model across the Twin Cities. And we're also networked with groups in Massachusetts, and California, North Carolina, and Michigan, and all of these other places around the country who want to do exactly the same thing. And that's not something that I or Cooperative Energy Futures can do alone. That's something that we need a movement to be done. Because the rules aren't in place in the way they need to be in a lot of those states. And the financial sector needs to be moved. And we need the people who are going to create the job training programs and help people build the worker clocks and all of that. And people who are going to create clean energy development companies that are actually just and community-based and all of that to make this type of system work, so that we're actually in a different kind of power relationship. We're in a power relationship where energy users get to tell developers what they need. The finance is oriented towards building community wealth. It's serving the needs of workers, and it basically drives utilities in the destination that we want, both because the politics and the rules say that they have to, and because they can't afford to do anything else anymore because we're taking away their business. That's the game plan here. I'm very excited about this game plan. It's going to take a whole lot of work. It's going to take thousands and tens of thousands of people for decades. But it pays for itself. That's all good, right? Yeah. So I'm going to just do a quick check-in on if this vision and strategy makes sense. And then I'm just going to tell a couple of cool stories about exciting things that are happening to close us out, and then we can close. So, questions or comments from anyone so far?
I'm just really excited. I was out of Minneapolis about 2 weeks and came back and I saw so many things that I was proud of about Minnesota going down. Moving, and this is really good about Minnesota and really good about you people and who proud of the done. And it's so helpful and it feels so dire and it feels so bad as a generation it's left to here. So really good to see this.
So, for folks who didn't hear,
I had a question for Sure. So, the like owner operating model is broad to the solar slash installation emergency report. That's the I think about taxes that makes it think of that. So that's very. I was just curious as to is there a direct legal barrier to like kind of mutual funding, that kind of thing, or like large, like larger organizations to be able to put in their tax credit to personal?
yeah, so the question is there a legal barrier to having many different entities put capital into a fund that allows them all to offset their taxes without them doing it individually? No, there is no legal barrier to that. In fact, that is what the existing tax equity companies do. But they do it on the...
Complexity barrier?
Sorry?
Complexity barrier?
It's a complexity barrier, and there are legal and administrative costs to it. We think that by being super efficient and working with people who know what they're doing because they've done it before, we can create our own tax equity fund that is setting up the rules the way we want it to, with about 6 months of time and $200,000 of legal costs. That's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money in comparison to that fund could source $100 million in capital.
Are you expecting a significant decrease in administrative salary?
$1,000 a year.
That's kind of what I was curious.
Because we can find some people with expertise who are perfectly comfortable working for 70 or 80,000. Which, you know,
Yeah, that'd be
I don't know
awesome.
what to do with it, you know?
Yeah, go on vacation.
Never mind. We don't have to do that. But yeah, essentially the big tax equity companies are creating those funds where lots of people can put in money and get the tax credits. It's just that to attract people to put in lots of money, they essentially go out and say, we're going to give you this ridiculously high rate of return, and they also want to make a really big margin on it. So they set it up so it's very extractive because they can, because nobody else has the money or the time or the expertise to do it. Cool. So I've mostly talked about solar because it's what I know best, and it is the most widely applicable. Other than probably the coastal areas of the Pacific Northwest and some parts of Alaska, you can do cost-effective solar virtually anywhere in the country. It varies a little bit because the utility prices are so low in some places that it's hard to make it pencil, but that's changing too. The current idea is that sometime this year, 2016, 47 states in the country will have grid parity for solar, which means solar is the same price as retail electricity. We're 47 states
This year,
this year.
how many already?
About a dozen or so have passed previous to this year. So we're right there. I've mostly been talking about community models, but there's also just going to be this whole revolution in just individual consumer buying of energy. Pretty soon, for people who can themselves be the financer and put up $15,000 or $20,000, it will be cheaper to put a solar panel on your roof. Over the course of 25 years, the solar panel will last than buying electricity from the grid, which will just, keep drawing more and more electricity away from utilities. Batteries are coming, improving in quality and falling in price to the point where at some point, like right now, if you put solar on your own roof, you're probably still connected to the grid in a net metering relationship. And the utilities are attacking those net metering relationships because they understand that if that keeps going, everyone is going to switch to net metering. And so all across the country, they're trying to impose huge fees on net metering, fixed fees. I think one passed in Nevada Nevada or Arizona, that was $50 a month, which takes out most of the value of going solar, which was the reason they did it. But the thing is, the more they do that, as battery technology comes along, the more incentive they're creating for people to just say, screw the utility, I'm not going to be connected to the grid anymore. I'm going to buy a solar panel, I'm going to buy a battery, and that's going to be cheaper for me than getting utility electricity. We're not there yet, because batteries are still too expensive, but the batteries are getting cheaper, the solar is getting cheaper, and the utility electricity is getting more expensive. And the utility death spiral just keeps happening. The more people who switch, the higher the cost of utility electricity is going to be, so the economics just get better and better. This means if you're in business models in this sector, you might have some rough spots, but long term, the next 30, 40, 50 years, it's only going to get better. This is a place where we need to be focusing on community wealth because all the drivers of the industry are pointing in the right direction. And there's already a highly profitable industry. It's just that communities and social justice folks haven't had a way into it yet.
I heard a presentation, and this I wasn't at Keystone. It's a weekend thing that they hold out in the river, and it was on that. And just, they were kind of huge batteries for a whole neighborhood. But it didn't hold it all. You don't have to have your own little.
Yep. And that's the other thing. I'm really excited about microgrids. The microgrids are about you site renewable energy in a community. You have a battery or fuel cell or some other kind of storage in the community. And pretty soon that community is its own energy neighborhood. When it needs to, it can cut off as a neighborhood from the grid, which even separately from the challenge with the future of utilities is a great thing. Because what if there is a power outage on the grid? This neighborhood could have an automatic switch that just says, we're disconnecting, our neighborhood's going to run itself for a few hours or a few days or weeks or however long it takes for the disaster to be fixed, or forever if it never gets fixed.
And could those communities also make money by producing the energy and then selling it back to the grid?
Yes, yes. And in fact, we could start to have a future where you have these like networks of microgrids, right? Like this. And then like this whole thing is also a node. And there's a whole other one over here, right? And that's not very visible for folks. I just drew a whole bunch of nested circles. And all of the folks in here are connected to each other, and all the folks in here are connected to each other, and they can all isolate themselves from all these folks, but they're also connected across. And they can buy and sell and trade power across those boundaries. And they're each sort of like a little neighborhood utility, powered by solar and wind and all the other energy resources.
And that gets rid of the argument of, well, the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing.
On that note, I wanted to highlight one really cool business model that I'm super excited about. again, I talked mostly about solar. Wind is an incredible resource that has been a little bit more difficult to solve these problems around because the efficient size is larger. To really get a good low-cost wind system, you need minimum 2, probably more like 3 or 4 or 5 industrial scale wind turbines.
Low cost per dollar, best for,
Exactly, low cost of the energy produced. You need a couple at least, and probably a few very large wind turbines, which are 400 feet tall and cost 2 or 2.5 million apiece. Okay, so we're talking about projects no longer in the hundreds of thousands or low millions. We're talking about projects in the 10 and 15 and 20 million, which again is still peanuts when we're talking about the old way of doing energy was the smallest power plant was 300 million, and a lot of them were billions. Wind is very cheap. You can produce wind cheaper than just about anything. In Texas, getting 100% clean, wind energy in some places is cheaper than grid energy because it's super productive. Part of the problem with wind is that, well, first of all, like any renewable energy, you can't control when it's on, and it actually tends to be strongest at night, which is the inverse of when most people use energy. So storage is a big thing, but the other business model that I'm really excited about is being tested by a guy I'm actually meeting with tomorrow, who is developing wind-solar hybrids. So essentially the model is you build, let's choose a big dark color, you build a couple of really big wind turbines, and on the same side as the idea. And in between them, you have a big array of solar panels. And the solar is going to produce power mostly during the day, and mostly during very sunny times, which tend to be the inverse of very windy times. The wind produces power, obviously, when it's windy. You connect these all through the same inverter, so you can kind of count the capacity. I don't know if you need to get that far into things actually. But basically, you get very reliable renewable power by combining these two things together. And you can size these. The systems he's developing have a capacity of 5 megawatts, which is very easy to fit into the existing grid in lots of places. If you have 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts or 50 megawatts, you sort of have to choose very few spots because there's not enough capacity to accept the energy, or you have to build a very expensive new transmission line to generate more energy than you're taking. But 5 megawatts, there's all sorts of little towns all over the place that have the capacity to accept 5 megawatts. In fact, I think that the analysis was there are enough spots on Minnesota's current grid that building these things we could power something like 45% of the state using current grid, no new grid infrastructure.
based on analysis
Timothy, sorry, I'm making noise. This is Paula. Can I ask a question?
Yep.
You know, I remember in my grandfather's farming days, him referring to wind chargers, which I think were really little wind turbines. And I guess it helps me think of a question of, do you see a place for really small, individual-sized technologies, like little teeny solar panels that people can just easily hook up to their roof, or little teeny wind chargers, you know, that people can use? Do you see a path for that kind of thing, or does it look like that kind of thing might happen?
Paula, can you unmute? Paula, oh, thanks, Paula. Sorry for the infinite audio loops. The question was just potential for very small and micro scale clean energy applications. I think there is potential for it, but I don't think that that is a very efficient way to provide full home power for communities. I think that that model is very useful for example, in Highland Park, and we have somebody from Highland Park, off-grid solar streetlights. You don't have to pay for the grid connection. You just put a loose solar panel on the streetlight with a battery, and it powers a streetlight. Or remote locations, like where there's no grid, rural areas, forested areas, small-scale renewable energy, or portable applications. I mean, we've had tiny little solar cells and pocket calculators for decades. Having the same types of thing on cell phones, laptops, all of those types of things. I see that kind of thing. The issue is when you go really small like that, your per unit cost is quite high. And so it doesn't really make sense, or it makes less sense on a whole community basis. If you have a community that has an existing grid, it's not a very efficient way of doing it. But if you don't have an existing grid, or if the stuff you're trying to power is moving all the time, it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, in much of the global south, that's the way they do it. Very, very small solar and wind systems that are completely off-grid, because that's all the energy that they need. And it's much cheaper to do it that way than paying thousands and thousands of dollars to bring a wire in from hundreds of miles away. Tens of thousands, millions of dollars.
Kind of that same thing on the motorhome, small 1975 motorhome, and we had them on a roof.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had to plug in anything.
Mm-hmm.
It ran.
Cool. Yeah, we're about at time. I just wanted to bring up a couple of other notes of just things to look into or to explore further. This has definitely been an intro into this stuff. I love to talk about this and go way into the details of the business development and financial modeling and how you work with all these different partners. And it's been a great learning experience, and I think it's the kind of thing that I'm just starting to get really, really good at. And I'm looking forward to people all over the country getting really, really good at rapidly in the next couple of years. There are ways that even without the right, universal rights to sell energy, that you can negotiate and push the utility to buy energy. And even if there isn't universal choice, you can create ownership entities that are composed of many members of the community. So in Ithaca, New York, there's a project called Black Oak Wind, where they essentially created a business that is owned by, I don't remember exactly how many, but a couple of dozen community members who own this wind farm. And they negotiated with their utility to buy power at a price that made the wind farm. So it's not a cooperative, they can't actually use the energy, but they're creating this ownership structure and selling the energy. I had mentioned in my second training that there's a federal law called PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act, which essentially requires any utility to buy energy from a renewable source at avoided cost, meaning the cost that they avoid by having that renewable energy as opposed to burning coal or whatever. There are a growing number of fights, both in rural electric co-ops and increasingly with private companies, to legally force them to define what their avoided cost is. And if you get them to define what their avoided cost is, and that's public information accessible to everyone, effectively you have that same thing you had in Germany, where you have a guaranteed price that everyone gets to make. And it's not necessarily a terribly high price. It might be 3 cents or 5 cents or 7 cents, which is not going to work very well for solar, but will work excellently for wind. And the more that you can start to set that precedent, the more you'll start seeing rural electric co-ops and local governments and just groups of ordinary people come together and build that because the utility has to buy it. The other big thing that I'll just mention but won't go into because we are at time is the power that cities have in changing how the rules work with their energy utilities. In nearly every state in the country, the city has a legal right to say, we want to form our own utility. We want to municipalize it and kick our big utility out and do it ourselves. It's difficult. It can be very expensive. It's sometimes worth doing. But even just the threat of doing it puts a lot of pressure on the utility to give you what you want. And that can be acceptance of some of these things. It can be agreement to buy energy at a certain rate from certain developers. It can be all sorts of things that make this basic model work better. And so I think the name of the game and just looking forward, we really have to start thinking about how do we get the rules set so that lots of energy users can make choice, so that the utility has to buy and use all the tools in our organizing tool belt to get those things happen. And then we build businesses, particularly co-ops, but not all of them will be co-ops, that can manage this set of relationships in a way that builds community wealth and gain power over the financial sector to make this whole thing work. I'm going to close here. I want to thank you all for participating, and I hope this has been a really useful start, both today and in this whole 4-part series. I'm excited to join with all of you and thousands and millions of other people to make this whole story of taking over the energy sector into reality.
Thanks, Timothy.
Bye, everyone.